You know, this has been a hard week for our nation and our society and the world. For me, I mark the beginning of this week with looking at the front page of the New York Times a week ago. That's something that we'll always remember, that image where we were just about to reach the 100,000 deaths mark from the pandemic in this country. And the list of the names of countless people, their names, their ages, and a brief sentence about their lives. And then of course, later in the week, there was the horrific images that went around the internet of the death of George Floyd, who died under the knee, with his neck beneath the knee of a police officer in Minneapolis. And his final words were, "I can't breathe. I can't breathe." You know, when we experience these kinds of shocking images in the world and in our lives, I'm sure you're like me, there is this moment when we first see this, where it is so overwhelming to see such a thing that we're kind of stunned. It might even be just for a fleeting moment, but there's just this state of being stunned into a kind of silence, an inability to speak, because sometimes there are experiences of devastation or loss that are so profound that our mind can't even project what to do at seeing such a thing, like those thousands of names, or the death of another Black man beneath the knee of a white police officer. It just keeps coming. And when we have those moments, there's no words. We're stopped dead in our tracks. And even days later, I have difficulty putting into words the nature of that stunned silence, of unspeakable loss that you experience in experiencing something like that. Now, we all know, of course, that after that moment of stunned silence, there is the progression of reactions that come. For most of us, when we see these images, the next progression of emotions that come is a lot of anger. A lot of anger at our leadership, our country, our culture, for all of the things that we seem to be endlessly perpetuating that continues in such senseless deaths that can be stopped, deaths that can be halted in our society, and yet it doesn't happen. And that kind of anger can then become overwhelming. And when I'm in the midst of that anger, as I'm sure we all have been, I try to remember some insights from our Jewish tradition, from our many thousands of year old tradition, where we have had to come through so many moments of stunned silence at the absolute injustice of this world and of the terrible losses that we have known. And ironically, one of the most powerful teachers of what to do beyond the anger comes from what we're recounting today on Shavuot, at the moment of the giving of the Torah. And so it's rather chutzpahdik for me to do this kind of likening the giving of the Torah to this moment of horror when we see these kinds of images from the media. But I'm doing that very thing today, and we'll see why. I'm going to read from you a midrash from Exodus Rabbah that describes the moment, the very moment that the Ten Commandments were beginning to be uttered. In other words, this is the moment of the first word of the Ten Commandments, not even the first word, the first letter of the Ten Commandments, in the word Anochi, right? The very first letter of that word. It says Rabbi Abahu in the name of Rabbi Yochanan. When the Holy One gave the Torah, no bird screeched, no fowl flew, no ox mooed, none of the angels flapped a wing, nor did the celestial beings chant Kadosh, Kadosh, Kadosh. The waves of the sea did not roar, and none of the creatures of the whole world uttered a sound. Throughout the entire world, there was only a deafening silence as the divine voice went forth speaking, Anochi Adonai Elohecha, I am the Lord your God. An incredibly powerful image of the entire world in that instant, in a kind of immovable silence that gave rise to those 10 commandments. And of course, this midrash echoes a very famous passage in the story of Elijah, who journeyed himself back to Mount Sinai in order to see if he could find a revelation from God the way his ancestors did at Mount Sinai. I'll read you this famous quote from the first book of Kings. Elijah writes, "There was a great and mighty wind, splitting mountains and shattering rocks by the power of the Lord, but the Lord was not in the wind. After the wind, an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. After the earthquake, fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, kol dimama daka, a still small voice." When Elijah heard that, he wrapped his mantle about his face and went out and stood at the entrance of the cave. Then the divine voice addressed him, "Why are you here, Elijah?" There it is again. Not in all of the sound and fury of this life, but in the moments of total stillness and silence. It's those moments, any moment in life, when we are in that immovable silence. On Thursday night at the Tikkun Leil Shavuot, I read from the words of the Piazetzner Rebbe. The Piazetzner Rebbe, as I mentioned on Thursday night, was the Rebbe of the Warsaw Ghetto during the Shoah, during the Holocaust. And there's a collection of various teachings he gave during the period of the Holocaust called Esh Kodesh. And I want to share with you something about his own journey and relationship to these ideas. He actually was giving a Devar Torah about the story of Joseph. If you recall the story of Joseph, he had these dreams about how his sheaf of grain stood up straight and his brother's sheaves of grain turned and bowed to his sheaf of grain, and that got him into big trouble. The Hebrew word for a sheaf of grain is aluma. And aluma is similar to the Hebrew word ilem, which means mute or unable to speak. And this is the Piazetzner's words now about that subject. He says there is a distinction between the word harisha, meaning silence, and the word ilmut, meaning muteness. The word harisha generally refers to someone who has the potential for engaging freely in speech, but nevertheless does not speak. On the other hand, when the Jew is so broken and crushed that he has nothing to say, then he does not feel. He has not even a head or a heart with which to perceive or feel. This is not silence, harisha, but rather muteness, ilmut, like the mute who has no power of speech. However, there are times when the Jewish person sees that, heaven forfend, it is inevitable that a time of trouble come to pass, involving decline, degradation, and collapse. He then takes hold of himself, adapting himself to the time of trouble until the storm blows over. He says to himself, "At the present time, I am indeed mute, ilem." But even the mute can communicate by signaling in a manner appropriate to his condition. So I too will speak a bit. I will sign from within my muteness. But when, heaven forfend, Israel's troubles continue to increase so that each individual feels even more broken and crushed, then a condition is reached where the state of ilem, muteness, has become still more powerful so that it is impossible to communicate, even as a mute does. When what happens then is that my sheaf or muteness, alumati, rose and stood. At first I watched and wanted to succumb and live a life of muteness. But when the muteness threatened to prevail, I could no longer bear it. So I took hold of myself, crying out to God more. And then your sheaves, your muteness turned around. That is, you too found strength through me. So I'm going to unpack that a little bit. He's talking about there are times in life where we are stunned into such a silence that it can feel completely overwhelming. where it feels like there's no way out. And what he's saying quite radically is that in those moments, in fact, in that place, that is where something new is born. Some kind of new urge rises up to find our destiny as the people of God. That's really what he's saying there. And so there it is, all over our tradition. The giving of the Torah, the whole world became still and silent. In the case of Elijah, it was only in that silence that he could find the voice of God calling to him. And in the case of the Piazetzner Rebbe, it is in the absolute inability to put into words the loss that he had known that led him to his mission in life. And by the way, he wrote those words in 1939, just after he had lost his entire family. So those words arose from the loss of a loved one. And that's exactly, of course, what we are doing here in this service of Yizkor. We are remembering when each of us, when we've lost a loved one, we had that moment where there were no words, where nothing could prepare us. Even if we were expecting it, nothing can prepare us for the experience of loss that we had known. So I want to ask us in this moment to have the courage to go back to that very moment when a loved one passed, to that first moment when you knew that they were gone. Maybe you were there with them at their deathbed. Maybe it was getting a phone call. Maybe it was hearing it from somebody else. That moment when that overwhelming inability to move or speak or think or even feel, when that overwhelmed us. Maybe it was later, as when my mom died, as I described once, it was really only hit me when I was sitting Shiva. Maybe it was months later for some of us. It doesn't matter when. What I want to ask us to do in this moment is simply be with ourselves in that moment. To be a loving presence and not to push away the pain of that moment, but to be with our very selves. Because when we listen deeply to the silent stillness of that experience, the promise of something new emerges. We all know when we go through grief that grief changes us. We're really never the same after we lose a loved one. We can't ever be the same again. And something about our tradition and meeting that experience of anything in life that stills us, where we no longer have the words, when we link ourselves to that experience, it's almost as if there are times when we have the experience of being in a vacuum, and we say nature abhors a vacuum. Our souls abhor a vacuum. And so when we allow ourselves to simply notice what is happening in that vacuum, something remarkable can happen. We can see that there really isn't a vacuum at all in this life and whatever lies beyond life. What we see instead is that there is always the presence of God there. And close to the presence of God are the neshamot, the souls of our loved ones. We experience it as a vacuum, but actually their presence is always there. And sometimes it's only when we get still enough that we can experience that which is beyond life and death, that calls to us and that can change us forever. With the service of Yizkor, I ask that we have, again, the courage to be with that experience of stillness. There are words and there'll be music, chanting and things like that. But the most important thing you can do, maybe just before or just after you recite your paragraph of Yizkor, is to get still. Get to the place where there are no words, where there's not even, you don't know what to feel. Just listen. It's not an auditory listening, it's a listening with the soul, because in that place there is a voice, a kol demama daka, a still small voice. It's not just the voice of God, it's the voice of your loved one, calling you to live up to your potential and your destiny in honor of their love. And on this Shavuot, during a pandemic and during the terrible time of racial violence in this country, let's also keep in mind all those who have passed because of this terrible disease, for all the people of color and other people who are victims of bigotry and the racism and hatreds that plague this country no less than the plague of the virus. Let's keep their souls also with us in that stillness and in the silence. And may those souls join with the voice of God in calling us to our destiny, to take charge of our society, to elect new leadership, to find a way forward, to heal our lives and to heal the world.